Imagine a vehicle that can drive you 5 miles for a penny. A vehicle that needs no petrol, just a battery. And that takes the press of a button to start, the squeeze of a lever to stop. That needs no license, no road tax, and you can drive whether you're 14 or 40. A vehicle that costs just £399. The Sinclair C5. It's a new power in personal transport. The Sinclair C5, £399. Want to buy one? Want to see one? Or simply want to read all about it? Just dial 100 and ask for free phone C5 now.
Electric vehicles, or EVs. In the modern day, they're common enough. Pretty much every major car manufacturer has an EV on offer these days, and whether or not you like them or hate them, they certainly exist. But they're not a new thing at all. The idea of an electric car goes back way earlier than you think, and we're not going to go all the way back today, but we are going to go back quite a ways to the 1980s. Yep, someone tried to put an electric car out to market in the 1980s, and he's a man that, especially if you're British, you probably know. Sir Clive Sinclair. Now, Sinclair's claim to fame has nothing to do with vehicles. It has to do with the computer industry. He founded Sinclair Research Limited, which wound up producing several exceptional early computers, in particular the ZX Spectrum. And some of my American audience seeing this name might be like, hey, that's a Z. And I know, here we say Z. In other places, like the UK, they say Z. And every time I've ever heard anyone talk about the Spectrum, they always say Z. So I'm gonna go with the general pronunciation of it. Even Americans I've heard talk about the Spectrum say Z just in this instance. Of course, I could, in order to encourage angry comments and therefore boost the algorithm, call it the ZX Spectrum just to annoy people, but I myself just cringed at that pronunciation, so I won't be doing that, and it doesn't really matter anyway, because this video isn't even about the Spectrum. Though, originally it was. See, I stumbled upon this topic because I wanted to look into the downfall of Sinclair Research Limited. It's a company that did some solid work, but did wind up failing, even though the Spectrum in particular is one of the most influential computers ever made. It's also one of the best-selling British computers, selling over 5 million units. If you speak to literally any British computer nerd, I can almost guarantee that they'll know exactly what a Spectrum is and probably be super excited to talk about it, because they were exceptional devices in their way. But again, we're not talking about that. Sinclair Research would eventually go on a steep downslope, and this was due partially to increased competition, but also because products they made after the Spectrum didn't sell nearly as well. The TV-80, for example, which was a pocket television, sold awfully, even though it was a pretty neat device on its own, and the successor to the Spectrum, the Sinclair QL, did really bad, for a lot of reasons that I'll go into detail on if you guys want me to talk about the whole story of Sinclair Research. Let me know in the comments. However, another reason the company failed had to do with a bit of a side project that technically wasn't underneath Sinclair Research, but it did wind up costing Sir Clive Sinclair himself a lot of money, and he had to sell quite a few shares in Sinclair Research in order to fund this venture. This venture would involve the founding of a separate company called Sinclair Vehicles in March of 1983. And this is because Sinclair loved computers, but he was an inventor, he was a tinkerer, he was a guy that liked making cool stuff. And some of the cool stuff, like the aforementioned Spectrum, was really great, really marketable, and people liked it. Not everything he made did so hot, but he was really fascinated by electric vehicles and had been for years. As I said, the technology isn't necessarily new, it's just only recently has it become actually feasible for a significant amount of people to get a hold of. And this mostly has to do with battery technology. Nowadays, the batteries that modern EVs use will last you a decent amount of time. They still don't have quite as good a range as gas vehicles, and they certainly still take a lot longer to, well, recharge, refuel, whatever, than a gasoline vehicle would. But if you're the kind of person that doesn't go very far, only in and around town locally, an EV will certainly do the job. Sinclair's interest in electric vehicles dated back to the 1950s, while he was working for the electronics company Solartron. And by the 1970s, he was the head of his own electronics company known as Sinclair Radionics. It was about the time that he started tinkering seriously with the possibility of actually creating a legitimate electric vehicle. Given the technology back then, he felt that you couldn't just stick a battery in an actual car and have it work. Cars were designed to use gas, and they were gonna keep using gas, and with the limited battery technology that he had to work with, you couldn't put one in a regular car and expect it to get very far at all. Sinclair felt that whatever he came up with had to be built from the ground up, with the battery in mind, and he put a significant amount of his effort into the motor. He felt the motor should be as small and as light as possible, and therefore be as efficient as possible, because the heavier the vehicle was, the more power it was going to take to move, and again, battery technology, not as good as it is now, they didn't have a lot of energy to work with. Alongside one of his employees, Chris Curry, they came up with a pretty crude prototype. They managed to create a wafer-thin electric motor that they mounted on a child's scooter, with a button on the handlebars to activate it. It worked in the technical sense, but this obviously wasn't going to be a marketable invention, at least in terms of replacing a car. At this point, other elements started taking precedence over the whole electric vehicle thing, and they started focusing their efforts more into the computers. Sinclair wouldn't get back to the electric vehicle idea until 1979, Christmas of that year, so almost 1980. This time he approached a former Radionics employee, Tony Wood Rogers, to help him look into a personal electric vehicle concept. Sinclair's vision and initial pitch for what he was looking for was not a replacement for a car, but a replacement for a moped. That meant it would be smaller, lighter, and wouldn't necessarily need to go very fast. The final product should have a maximum speed of about 30 miles per hour, so not exactly a highway vehicle, but that was not the intention, of course. The early specifications, as well as the prototypes based off of it, were designated the C1. The C stood for Clive. As a concept, it was meant to address short-distance transportation needs, with a range of about 30 miles, maybe a little beyond that, but no further. And it was supposed to be engineered as simply as possible, using injection-molded plastic components and a polypropylene body. Naturally, since it was smaller and cheaper, it would of course be less expensive. The final product would be retailed at about £500. It's about £2,000 in today's money, which isn't that bad for something like this. Sinclair opted to stick with the then-existing lead-acid battery technology and not develop anything more efficient than that. The reason is that he felt that if he could get the electric vehicle market to exist, battery manufacturers would therefore be more inclined to develop better batteries. This was probably not a good call in retrospect, since one of his biggest problems was that lead-acid batteries just couldn't take a vehicle very far no matter how small you made it. It was just the way the technology was. Though in other avenues, he did do his due diligence. The chassis for the C1, which would be fitted with a shell in 1982, was even subjected to wind tunnel testing to make the vehicle aerodynamic, not because it was ever meant or ever could go very fast, but because they wanted to reduce even the most minimal wind resistance to improve efficiency by just that little bit. The basic design was in place by 82, and then Sinclair approached a motor design company, Ogle Design of Letchworth, to provide professional styling assistance as well as production engineering, but they didn't get along very well. Sinclair, again, was looking at this from the ground up as a brand new thing, not just another car. But Ogle approached it like that of a car, and the result was that their design increased the weight by nearly 330 pounds. Way too heavy for what Sinclair was looking for. By March of 83, Sinclair had stopped the whole program, and Ogle had told Sinclair that the design would be a flop. But he didn't give up. It was in '83 that he established the Sinclair Vehicles Company, and then he recruited Barry Wills, who was a former employee of the DeLorean Motor Company. Oh boy, that's a whole mess in and of itself, ain't it? Barry Wills was to lead Sinclair Vehicles as the managing director, even though initially Wills didn't even think that the project was worth it. But Sinclair was very convincing, and Wills opted to sign on. And they were helped along by changes in the British government's approach to electric vehicles. In March of 1980, they had abolished the vehicle excise duty for electric vehicles. The vehicle excise duty was an annual tax which had to be paid for most types of powered vehicles which were to be used or parked on public roads. This change meant EVs were exempt from the tax, and at the beginning of 1983, the Department of Transport was looking at introducing a new category of vehicle called an electrically assisted pedal cycle. The legislation for this passed in August of 1983, and Sinclair thought that the idea had a lot of merit when it came to what he was trying to work on. Not only was that type of vehicle exempt from insurance and vehicle taxes, nor would they need a driver's license or a helmet, which mopeds were required to have, but also on top of that, if it was a pedal cycle, it would reduce the strain and drain on a battery, and meant that in the event that you did wind up with a dead battery, the vehicle could still be moved relatively easily if he designed it right. It was an interesting idea that intrigued Sinclair, so he started putting that new concept into work. He was also motivated and helped along by the fact that it was such a new idea that there were no existing vehicles then on the market that would meet the standards prescribed under the new legislation. This gave him a lot of freedom in terms of what he was trying to do here. As long as it met the government's rules, it would count, though it did still have its own limitations. Under the standards that were in place, the maximum legal speed of this kind of vehicle would be limited only to 15 miles per hour. It couldn't weigh more than 60 kilograms, 130 pounds, and the motor couldn't be rated at more than 250 watts. But in Sinclair's mind, he saw this concept as a gateway into a more ambitious market of electric vehicles. Once he got this rolling, he could develop something bigger, maybe more like a proper car. As the technology got better, as he saw the success, as everything went great and wonderful and perfect and nothing terrible could possibly go wrong. Yeah, none of that happened for him, unfortunately. The whole thing was pushed forward by him. He was really gung-ho about it and really thought this was going to revolutionize everything. But he performed absolutely no market research to see if people even wanted an electric vehicle like this. He just kind of assumed that once people saw it, they would want it. And maybe sometimes that has worked for inventions in the past, but not always, and not in this case. But he did eventually wind up with a final product. Sinclair still decided to work with Ogle and gave them newer specifications. This time they came up with a three-wheeled design, and this was dubbed the C5. The only external research carried out on the design had to do with the handlebar positioning. The handlebars were placed underneath your legs, which is friggin' weird, but it did work. And once you got used to it, it actually was pretty easy to control. That wasn't a big issue, but they did want to make sure that it wasn't an issue. They didn't want to make sure anything else wasn't an issue, apparently. The development took place over 19 months in great secrecy. They refined the aerodynamics, but even in the early stages, there were still naysayers in the know who felt that it just wasn't very practical. Like, who was this for? Who was really going to use this thing? How would it improve anyone's daily life? Over, say, a bike. Because remember, this was an electrically assisted pedal cycle. It had actual pedals and a chain and everything. You could pedal it like normal. Granted, you were supposed to rely on the battery, and it was designed so that you could move it without pedaling at all, but it still had pedals. Full production began in November of 1984, and by January of 85, over 2,500 of the new C5s had been manufactured, without any being sold. Now, it isn't unusual for a company to have a bunch of stock ready to actually launch, and to be fair, the launch was meant to happen in January. The C5 hit the market on January 10th, 1985, at a major event held at Alexandra Palace in North London. Sinclair was known for a glitzy sort of style at these kind of events. Women handed out press packs, and there were a whole bunch of promotional giveaways, magazines, hats, pullovers, t-shirts, the whole shebang. The unveiling was incredibly dramatic, and 6 of the C5s were driven by women dressed in gray and yellow, burst out of 6 cardboard boxes, and drove around the arena. It was just insane. Sinclair also announced the launch of a £3 million 3-month-long advertising, print, and television campaign, and the C5 was going to be made available by mail order at a cost of £399. But this launch event, as dramatic and fancy as it may have been, was already a complete disaster, basically from the get-go. Not only was the C5 visually not very impressive, but the press were given the opportunity to try it out, and that went really badly. Many of the C5s failed quite fast, for a variety of different reasons. One of the reporters found that it couldn't cope with the slopes at Alexandra Palace. Also, mind you, this was happening in January. In the United Kingdom. It was cold, and it's a tricycle. It's not an enclosed vehicle, so it wasn't exactly a comfortable experience, even based off of just the temperature. Oh, also, one of the C5s overheated. In January. In the UK! I don't know how you do that! The press slammed the C5, calling it a lot of things, and pointed out many of the flaws. It was low speed, couldn't go very far, and at the end of the day felt more like a toy than an actual vehicle. Was it kind of fun? Yeah, but it wasn't really taken seriously. Kind of like the Segway, actually. Plus, they kept calling it an electric car, much to Sinclair's annoyance because he never thought of it as an electric car. First of all, looking at it, it isn't. We can visually see that. He insisted, no, it's a type of electric vehicle, but it's not a car. The press kept calling it a car, making it look a lot more silly than it probably was. They also found that one of the more intriguing issues was that it was meant to ride on the road, right? Well, not only are you pretty slow, but also, you sat fairly low. Oftentimes, right behind the exhaust fumes of regular cars. Which, yeah. As a result of the relatively low seating position, there was of course concern about safety, which Sinclair was annoyed with because, admittedly, the vehicle really wasn't any more dangerous than a moped or a bike. It was fairly stable and easy to control, so if you're gonna allow all those, this wasn't any worse. But the British Safety Council, or BSC, when they tested it, gave it a very, very, very critical report. It was so brutal to the vehicles that Sinclair even said he would sue for defamation, though that never actually happened. But even beyond the press and the suits and the government, the regular people just weren't that interested in the C5. It was designed to be kind of like the mopeds, a middle ground between bikes and cars. But the truth was, it just didn't appeal to either market. People thought of it as kind of a novelty, not something to take very seriously. Again, it only had a top speed of 15 miles per hour, and its range was only 20 miles. And that could vary quite a bit depending on how much you chose to pedal, or how many hills are in your area. It was just very too much. The technology itself was still in its infancy, and it kind of failed to catch on. It probably didn't help that Sinclair had launched the thing in January. Early reviews pointed out the weather issue, saying that they were cold when they came back, but also you would have been cold on a bike too. Like, obviously you aren't supposed to ride the thing when it's cold out. Who does that? Honestly. But there were members of the general public that did give them a chance. Just the day after the launch event, they did get a whole bunch of orders. After they sent out a bunch of mail order forms to customers of Sinclair's computers, within 4 weeks they had managed to sell 5,000 of the C5s. But that was about all they sold. Sales pretty much flatlined after that. Some people even returned them, asking for refunds because of the limited range and the fact that the C5s just hated hills. They could not go up steep grades at all. The whole thing was a complete fiasco. Sinclair still held on to hope that perhaps fortunes for the vehicle would change once the weather got better. Namely, once it was warmer outside. and he looked at the possibility of exporting it to other markets overseas. But any bids involving that failed. Further production on any new C5s was terminated in August of 1985. With summer almost over, and sales not picking up, well, the writing was on the wall, to be brutally honest. At the end, they put together about 14,000 of the C5s. While they initially did tell the media that they did plan on starting up production again, this never actually happened. The assembly line remained closed permanently, and that also spelled the end for Sinclair Vehicles as a company. They only had one product, and it didn't sell. And mind you, they had spent millions of pounds on this thing. 7.75 million was owed to creditors, and 7 million was owed to Sir Clive, as he had invested so much money and time into this. And many of the creditors wound up not actually being paid back at all, since there was very little they could even liquidate. All they had was the remaining inventory, but they did wind up getting rid of a lot of them without actually scrapping them. A few companies bought them at discounted rates and marked them up quite a bit, but this time marketing them as kind of a sophisticated toy. In that guise, people actually bought them, interestingly enough, because while the C5 was a horrific, awful, terrible failure that basically no one was interested in buying outside of perhaps for a toy or novelty, there are a group of C5 enthusiasts in the modern day. Yeah! For one thing, people love Sir Clive Sinclair. He contributed a lot to British culture as well as technology, but also, some people think the C5 got a bad rap unfairly. There's a bit of a cult following behind it. Collectors began purchasing them as investment items and would wind up later reselling them for a lot more than the original retail price. As it turns out, there was a secret, quiet market for the C5 to an extent, mostly among drivers that had been actually banned from driving. People that had lost their licenses. You didn't need a license for a C5. And modern enthusiasts have made all sorts of modifications to their C5s to improve their performance, or even just because it's wacky nonsense. Here's one fitted with a jet engine. Seriously! What? No! But there are people that do like them to a certain extent in their way. And I guess they are a neat invention. They failed completely, awfully, totally, without question. But they were interesting. And Sinclair was coming from a good place, as he often did. He really was gung-ho about electric vehicles, and felt that there was a market for them. He even still developed more. Even while the C5 was still being worked on, he was brainstorming other concepts like the C10 and the C15, much larger vehicles that never left the drawing board. But in 1992, he released the Sinclair Zyke, which was a smaller electric bicycle. It was also a commercial failure, but, he kept trying. The point was that, while, yes, the C5 was a mess, you can still respect the spirit about it. I myself personally am not particularly fond of EVs. I don't use one myself as it just doesn't suit my needs. But I understand that many people do like them and are buying them and using them. And Sinclair obviously felt that, at some point, it might be possible to do that. I think his issue was timing. It was just too early. The technology wasn't mature, the battery could only handle so much, but one can still respect that kind of forward thinking. Also, he gave people the ZX Spectrum. And I've never heard a bad word ever said about the ZX Spectrum. Seriously, if you want me to talk about the whole of Sinclair, just let me know, because I would love to be able to talk about the Spectrum. It's a very cool story. And with that, a special thank you go to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Lord R444, iSurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Josh Johnson, Caleb Brainwaters, Perez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Dolinsky, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitsune 131 just 232, Mark Holding, Mr. Terrevel, Hayden DeGrow, Bad Train Puns Are Best, Kurt Forkum, Harry, Drew Debris, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Duralshi, A Person 723, William Nemo, Dr. Racer 78, Shimasu, Metal for Life Guy, Andrew Bowen, Crimson Rose, Ryan Wehofer, Zintac M, Boss K, Orange Glass, Andy, Ohio Trucker 1, Windy City Rails, John Videolaw, AET Museum, Extra Special J, Bob Condirk, Jared Brussel, Levi Anderson, Darrell Williams, DE Ultra, NJ1969, Acoletti, Jonathan Coco, John, Connor Hahn, AJNH86, Brian Philly, DFL Church, Murder Drones Doll, Nathaniel Brown, Robert Baldassari, Liam Wright, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.